Shaq was just passing by when he spotted a little boy crying outside a toy store. Inside, the manager sneered. He had just kicked the kid out for not looking rich enough. Shoppers glanced away. Employees stayed silent. But Shaq? He wasn't about to let that slide. What happened next turned humiliation into the ultimate payback, shocking the entire store and changing one boy's life forever. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Lucas stood outside the massive glass doors, his tiny hands balled into fists, his lower lip trembling. His wide, tear-filled eyes darted between the bright, colorful displays inside and the towering figure of Mr. Reynolds, the store manager, who now stood at the entrance with arms crossed, glaring down at him. The boy's cheeks were flushed, streaked with silent tears. His small chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths as he struggled to process what had just happened. Inside the store, children laughed as they raced down the aisles, picking out action figures, dolls, and video games. Their parents smiled, their carts filled with expensive toys. But Lucas, he wasn't allowed in. Reynolds had made sure of that. "I told you already, kid," the manager snapped, voice cold. "If you're not buying, you're not browsing." Lucas sniffled, his fingers twitching at his sides. He had only wanted to look, just for a minute, to imagine, just for a second, that one of those toys could be his. But instead, he had been shoved outside like a stray dog. From inside the store, a young employee named Mia watched the scene unfold, her stomach twisting. She had worked here for months and had seen Mr. Reynolds do this before, turning away kids who didn't look like they belonged. But never this harshly, never with tears involved. Lucas turned his gaze upward, squinting at the glowing neon sign above the entrance. "Every child's dream come true." He let out a shaky breath. The words felt like a cruel joke. Mia clenched her fists, biting her lip. She wanted to step in, to say something. But Reynolds was her boss. Speaking up could cost her everything. Lucas wiped his sleeve across his damp cheeks, his shoulders sagging. He had no choice but to turn away. Then, a sleek, black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb. The back door swung open, and a towering figure emerged. Shaquille O'Neal stretched, adjusting his jacket, when his eyes landed on the small, defeated boy standing alone on the sidewalk, his brows furrowed. Something wasn't right. He watched for a moment, taking in the way Lucas clutched at his own sleeves, how his tiny shoulders shook ever so slightly. Then with a deep breath, Shaq stepped forward, walking straight toward him. Shaq watches the boy for a moment, then walks straight toward him. Shaq never ignored a kid in distress. The moment he saw the little boy wiping his eyes, shoulders shaking, something inside him shifted. He had seen that look before, the kind of heartbreak that no child should ever feel. He took a step forward, then another. By the time he reached the boy, he crouched down to meet his eye level, his massive frame towering even in that position. "Hey, little man," Shaq said, his voice gentle. "What's wrong?" Lucas sniffled, his lip trembling. His small hands curled into fists as if holding on to the last bit of his pride. He hesitated, casting a quick glance back at the toy store. They kicked me out," he finally muttered. "Said I couldn't touch the toys." Shaq's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered toward the store's entrance. "Who told him that? Who said that to you?" His voice was softer now, but there was something beneath it, an edge, a quiet storm waiting to break. Lucas hesitated again, then lifted his tiny hand, pointing toward the glass doors. Shaq followed the direction of his finger, and there, standing behind the counter, was a man with a smug expression plastered across his face. The store manager. Shaq could recognize that smirk anywhere. The kind of look that thrived on power over the powerless. The kind of man who thought he could get away with it, and that didn't sit right with him. Before Shaq could say another word, a woman walking past them overheard Lucas's words and scoffed. "That manager always acts like that," she muttered, adjusting the strap of her designer purse. "If you don't look rich, he treats you like dirt." Shaq exhaled through his nose, slowly, deliberately. His massive hands curled for a moment before relaxing. "All right, that's how Reynolds wanted to play? Time to teach someone a lesson." He placed a giant arm around Lucas's tiny shoulders, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "Come on," Shaq said, standing up to his full height. "Let's see what they have to say." Lucas's eyes widened. "Whoa, we're going in." Shaq nodded, flashing him a grin. "Oh yeah, little man, we're going in." And with that, he led. Lucas straight through the doors. Shaq throws an arm around Lucas's shoulder. Come on, let's see what they have to say. The moment Shaq and Lucas stepped inside, a subtle shift ran through the store. The bright, cheerful music played on, and the colorful displays of dolls, action figures, and video games still lined the walls. But the energy had changed. Several employees paused mid-task, their eyes flickering toward the entrance. A few whispered to one another, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition as they spotted the towering figure beside the small boy. But Mr. Reynolds, he remained oblivious. He was busy adjusting his tie, scanning the store like a hawk searching for prey. His focus landed on Lucas, and an irritated sigh escaped his lips. Without even noticing who was standing beside the boy, Reynolds strode forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. I already told you, kid, he snapped, his voice clipped and impatient. We don't allow... Then he stopped. His eyes traveled up, past broad shoulders, past an impossibly large chest, past the amused smirk now forming on a face he should have recognized immediately. Reynolds blinked. For a second, just a second, uncertainty flickered in his expression. But then, as if reminding himself that he was in charge here, he straightened his back and forced a polite smile. Sir, he said, his voice carefully measured, we have a strict policy against unsupervised children disturbing our customers. The words hung in the air. Lucas flinched. Shaq's expression didn't change, but something in the air around him did. A subtle shift. A warning. He slowly uncrossed his arms, exhaling through his nose before speaking. Disturbing? His voice was quiet but heavy, a weight pressing down on the room. The only thing disturbing here is your attitude. A hushed murmur rippled through the store. People were listening now. A woman near the checkout exchanged glances with another shopper. A father resting a toy truck in his cart tilted his head slightly, watching. Behind the counter, Mia, the young employee who had seen everything, held her breath. For a moment, there was silence. Then Reynolds rolled his eyes. Oh, come on, he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Sir, if you can't afford to shop here, maybe you should take your business elsewhere. The store went completely still. A cashier's hand slipped, sending a plastic toy crashing onto the counter. A little boy in line tugged on his mother's sleeve. Mom, he whispered, eyes wide. That's Shaq. Shaq's smirk deepened. Reynolds had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Reynolds rolls his eyes. Look, sir, if you can't afford to shop here, maybe you should take your business elsewhere. Big mistake. The store was frozen in silence. All eyes were locked on the massive figure standing near the entrance, his presence almost too big for the brightly lit aisles filled with plush toys and action figures. Mr. Reynolds still had his arms crossed, his smirk lingering, but cracks were forming. Before Shaq could even respond, a high-pitched voice broke through the tension. Mom, that's Shaq! A little boy standing in line clutched an action figure to his chest, his wide eyes bouncing between his mother and the 7-foot-tall man who had just walked in. The entire store shifted. Whispers spread like a wildfire, catching dry grass. Wait, is that really him? No way, Shaq! Here! Oh my God, it is him! Customers turned their heads, some pulling out their phones, while employees at the register froze mid-task. Reynolds blinked, his smirk twitching. His brain was lagging behind reality. A teenage employee behind the counter gasped and leaned toward him. Sir? He muttered under his breath. That's Shaquille O'Neal. Reynolds stiffened. It took half a second for the name to fully sink in. His face drained of color. The Shaquille O'Neal? The NBA legend? The business mogul? The man who could buy this entire store chain with a phone call? And he had just insulted him. He had just kicked out a little boy, right in front of one of the most generous athletes in the world. The energy in the store shifted completely. Employees stepped back. Customers held their breath. A woman inched forward, phone raised, already recording. Shaq? Shaq just chuckled. The sound was low, slow, and knowing. Reynolds' throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Shaq rocked back on his heels, amusement flickering in his deep-set eyes. So, he said, his voice smooth, calm, too calm. He folded his arms across his massive chest, towering over the suddenly very nervous manager. I can't afford it, huh? Reynolds' lips parted, but nothing came out. Behind the counter, Mia, the young employee who had watched it all unfold, bit her lip to keep from grinning. Lucas, still standing beside Shaq, tilted his head up at him. His eyes were still puffy from crying. But now there was hope. Shaq looked down at him, then back at Reynolds. He let the tension stretch, let the weight of the moment settle into the air. Then his lips curled into a grin. How about this? Shaq's voice was casual, smooth, but dangerous. Lucas, he said, giving the boy a small nod. How about we buy every single toy in here? Shaq turns to Lucas. How about we buy every single toy in here? Reynolds' face was frozen in a pale mask of shock. He had made a mistake. A colossal mistake. Sir, I didn't mean... He stammered, his voice losing all of its earlier confidence. Shaq didn't even let him finish. He waved a massive hand, shutting him down effortlessly. Nah, Shaq said, shaking his head. Don't backtrack now. His voice was cool, controlled, but his eyes, they carried the weight of every kid who had ever been told they weren't good enough. You judge this kid, Shaq continued, glancing down at Lucas, who still stood by his side, clutching the hem of his own shirt nervously. Now watch what happens. Then Shaq turned on his heel and walked straight to the register. The employees, still reeling from the realization of who was in their store, stood frozen. Shaq tapped the counter lightly with his knuckles, snapping them out of it. Let's go. Ring up everything. The young cashier, a nervous teenager wearing a name tag that read Kevin, blinked rapidly. Everything? He repeated. Shaq's expression didn't change. Did he stutter? Everything. Kevin swallowed hard, his fingers hovering over the register keys. Behind him, the other employees scrambled into action. The store suddenly erupted into a controlled chaos. Workers darting up and down aisles, grabbing toys off shelves, piling them onto the counter. Bags were ripped from under the registers, stuffed with dolls, race cars, board games, and action figures. Lucas's eyes widened as he watched the store empty before his very eyes. Other customers, who had been watching in stunned silence, began whispering, some pulling out their phones, recording the entire thing. Reynolds? Reynolds looked like he was about to faint. His mouth kept opening and closing, but he had no words. What was he supposed to say? What could he do? Shaq was buying his entire inventory in one move. One of the employees hesitated, holding up a massive Lego set. Even this one? Shaq smirked. Especially that one. The pile of toys at the register kept growing. Mountains of stuffed animals, remote control cars, and basketballs with famous player signatures. The beeping of the register rang through the store as Kevin's hands shook while scanning. Reynolds finally found his voice. Shaquille, he said, forcing a weak chuckle. Look, let's be reasonable. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe I can offer you a VIP discount. Shaq arched an eyebrow, amused. Now you want to be nice? Reynolds visibly swallowed. He had lost control. His power, his authority, was gone. A few minutes later, an employee whispered, "We're almost out of bags." Kevin hesitated before pressing the total button. His hands were visibly trembling. Total is, he choked, staring at the number on the screen. $57,482. The store gasped. Lucas almost fell over. Shaq, unbothered, reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black credit card. He placed it on the counter, tapping it twice. Run it. The machine beeped. Transaction approved. Just like that. Reynolds looked physically ill. Lucas tugged on Shaq's sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. You're really buying all of it? Shaq looked down at him, his expression softening. Yup. Lucas's lip trembled. But why? Shaq grinned. Because I can. Reynolds let out a sharp exhale, finally speaking up again. Well, I suppose I should personally thank you for your business, he stammered, forcing a fake smile. But Shaq didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he turned back to Lucas and crouched down so they were at eye level. Little man, let me ask you something, he said, his voice quieter now. You think it'd be cool if other kids got to have these toys too? Lucas's eyes lit up. You mean like giving them away? Shaq nodded, a knowing smile spreading across his face. Exactly. He turned toward the employees, his voice booming. Pack 'em up. We're donating them all. But then Shaq drops the biggest twist. He's not keeping the toys. He has a much better plan. The store was still reeling from what had just happened. Hundreds of toys bagged, A jaw-dropping $57,482 transaction processed in seconds. Shaq had just emptied the shelves, leaving employees scrambling to keep up. And yet, he wasn't done. Shaq turned back to the stunned workers behind the counter, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Pack them up." His tone was calm but firm. "We're donating them all to kids in need." Silence. Then all at once, the store erupted. "Wait, what? He's giving them away? No way, that's amazing." A few employees stopped mid-task, staring in disbelief. One of them, a young woman in a red vest, had to blink twice to make sure she heard correctly. Lucas's mouth dropped open. He clutched Shaq's sleeve, eyes wide with shock. "All of them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq nodded, smiling. "All of them." Lucas's lip quivered. He still didn't understand why Shaq was doing this, but something about it made his heart feel lighter. Reynolds? He looked like he had just been punched in the gut. This was supposed to be his victory. He was supposed to be celebrating the biggest sale of his career, bragging about numbers, profits, and exclusive clientele. Instead, he was watching every single item he sold walk out the door, for free. His face twisted in frustration, but he couldn't say a word. What was he supposed to do? Complain about a millionaire being generous? Shaq glanced down at Lucas again, crouching slightly so their eyes were level. "And you, little man," he said, his grin widening, "you get to pick anything you want." Lucas froze. The words hit him harder than expected. "Really?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Shaq chuckled. "Really?" Lucas's tiny hands clenched into fists at his sides, not out of anger, but because he didn't know how to react. For as long as he could remember, he had always been told no. "No, you can't have that. No, it's too expensive. No, put it back." Now for the first time, someone like Shaq was telling him, "Yes." Lucas sniffled, blinking fast as tears welled up in his eyes. From behind the counter, the employees watched, some of them getting emotional. Even Mia, the cashier who had stayed quiet before, wiped at her eyes discreetly. Shaq placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "Go on, take your pick." As Lucas turned toward the shelves, Reynolds clenched his jaw. He had officially lost. But Shaq? He wasn't done yet. He had one final surprise. But Shaq isn't done yet. He has one final surprise. The automatic doors whooshed open, and the store fell silent. A woman in a sleek navy blue pantsuit stepped inside, her sharp heels clicking against the tile. Her piercing gaze swept across the chaotic scene. The empty shelves, the employees scrambling to pack up bags, and a line of stunned customers still clutching their half-paid-for toys. She didn't look pleased. "What is going on here?" Her voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a blade. A few employees visibly stiffened. Others glanced nervously toward Reynolds, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. Shaq turned toward the voice, recognizing her immediately. Ms. Evelyn Carter, the owner of the store. Reynolds had barely recovered from Shaq's last blow, but this was worse. His boss was here. He quickly wiped the sweat off his forehead, adjusting his tie as he stumbled forward. "Ms. Carter, I can explain." But she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes had locked onto Shaq, and suddenly recognition dawned. Her expression shifted instantly. She strode forward, offering her hand. "Mr. O'Neill," she said smoothly, "I had no idea you were visiting our store today." Shaq took her hand, shaking it firmly. His expression remained calm, but not warm. "Oh, I wasn't planning on it," he said casually. "But then I saw a kid crying outside." Ms. Carter's brow furrowed. She turned her attention to the tiny boy standing beside Shaq, Lucas still holding onto the basketball he had picked. Her sharp eyes flicked toward her employees. "Someone better start explaining. Now." Mia, the young cashier who had witnessed everything, finally spoke up. "It was Mr. Reynolds," she said quickly, stepping forward. He threw Lucas out because he didn't look like he could afford anything." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Ms. Carter's eyes snapped to Reynolds. "Is this true?" Reynolds opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He was trapped. Shaq, watching the manager sweat bullets, decided to drive the final nail in. "Your manager," he said, his voice steady, "kicked out a kid for being too poor." Ms. Carter's expression hardened instantly. She turned her full attention to Reynolds, her arms crossing over her chest. The once smug manager took a step back. "Miss Carter, I was just enforcing policy." "We don't have a policy like that." Her voice was ice. He swallowed hard. I didn't mean... Ms. Carter cut him off. Pack your things. Reynolds' face drained of color. Her next words landed like a gavel in a courtroom. You're fired. Ms. Carter glares at Reynolds. Pack your things. You're fired. Reynolds stood frozen, his face drained of color. His lips quivered, words forming but never escaping. He looked at Ms. Carter, then at Shaq, then at the employees, desperately searching for someone, anyone to back him up. There was no one. Wait, he stammered. I think we're all just overreacting here. He forced a nervous chuckle, straightening his tie as if that could fix everything. Ms. Carter didn't budge. Her arms remained crossed, her eyes sharp. We don't tolerate discrimination here. Her words hit like a hammer on glass. A hush fell over the store. Shaq, he just watched, arms crossed, unbothered. Reynolds swallowed hard. His once arrogant smirk was now completely gone. I can change, he tried again. I've been a loyal manager here for years. Pack your things. The finality in Ms. Carter's voice left no room for argument. Reynolds looked around, eyes pleading. Nothing. Just cold stares. Even his employees, the people who worked under him, weren't coming to his defense. A few even exchanged smirks, relieved to see him finally face consequences. Reynolds let out a shaky breath and turned. His walk of shame to the back office began, shoulders hunched, hands clenched into fists. As the door clicked shut behind him, the store exhaled. And then, applause. It started slow, then grew. A woman clapped, then a man near the registers, then the employees. Soon the entire store erupted into cheers. Lucas looked around, his wide eyes shining. The same people who had ignored him before, who had walked right past him as he stood outside crying, were now cheering. For him. Shaq chuckled, reaching down to grab a shopping bag. He turned to the boy, holding it out. What did you pick? Lucas grinned, reaching into the bag. His small hands pulled out a basketball, bright orange, perfectly round, with the store's logo stamped on the side. Shaq raised a brow, impressed. A basketball, huh? Lucas nodded eagerly, his fingers gripping the ball tightly. I want to be like you someday. Shaq smiled. He crouched down, placing a giant hand on the boy's shoulder. Then keep practicing, little man, he said, and never let anybody tell you what you can't do. Lucas's lip trembled as he nodded fiercely. The employees behind the counter wiped their eyes. Even Ms. Carter's expression softened. Then, something happened no one expected. Lucas suddenly dropped the basketball and threw his arms around Shaq's waist. A tight hug, a silent thank you. Shaq, caught off guard for the first time that day, hesitated for half a second, then slowly wrapped his arms around the boy. The store, already filled with cheers, now had people sniffling, wiping away tears. Even Shaq, the toughest guy in the room, felt his throat tighten. He gave Lucas's back a small pat, then whispered, You're gonna be just fine, kid. Lucas squeezed tighter, and for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The store erupts into cheers, but one last moment leaves everyone in tears. Shaq turned to leave, the echoes of cheers still ringing through the store. His job here was done. Lucas got his moment. Reynolds got what he deserved. And the store? It would never be the same. But before Shaq could take another step, tiny footsteps pounded against the tile. Then a pair of small arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Shaq stiffened, caught off guard. It was Lucas. The little boy clung to him, his face pressed against Shaq's jersey. His fingers gripped tight, as if afraid that letting go would make all of this disappear. The store went quiet again. Shaq looked down, and when he saw the boy's face, his chest tightened. Lucas's eyes were red, watery, but not from sadness this time. This was different. Thank you, Lucas whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Nobody's ever stood up for me before. Shaq felt something heavy settle in his chest. He'd met a lot of kids in his life, signed autographs, taken pictures, given out sneakers. But this was different. This wasn't about fame, or money, or basketball. This was about a little boy who just wanted to be seen. Shaq slowly knelt, bringing himself down to Lucas's height. He placed a massive hand on the boy's small shoulder, squeezing gently. Never let people tell you what you can't do, Shaq whispered. You hear me? Lucas nodded fiercely, his lip trembling. The crowd, silent, watching, couldn't hold it in anymore. Someone sniffled. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Another wiped her nose on her sleeve. Then, applause, not just clapping, cheering, employees, customers, even Ms. Carter. The entire story erupted. A few people pulled out their phones, capturing the moment. Shaq gave Lucas's shoulder one last reassuring squeeze before finally standing. He turned, heading for the exit. But just as he reached the door, something caught his eye. A news van, a reporter, a camera pointed directly at him. As Shaq walks out, he notices a news reporter filming everything. Shaq barely made it 3 steps outside before the bright camera light flashed in his face. A microphone was suddenly thrust toward him. "Shaq! Shaq! Can you tell us what happened in there?" The voice belonged to a sharp-looking reporter, dressed in a crisp blazer, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Behind her, a news van idled at the curb, its satellite dish aimed at the sky. Shaq sighed, shaking his head with a smirk. He should have known this moment wouldn't stay quiet. "I just did what needed to be done," he said simply. The reporter wasn't letting up. "Is it true you bought out the entire store?" Shaq glanced back at the toy store, where employees were still packing up massive bags of toys to be donated. Lucas stood inside, gripping his new basketball with the biggest smile on his face. Shaq turned back to the camera. "Yeah," he said, grinning. "Figured some kids out there could use 'em more." The reporter's jaw dropped slightly. The cameraman zoomed in. It was exactly the kind of story the internet would eat up. And that's exactly what happened. The sun had barely risen when social media exploded. Shaq the hero was trending worldwide. News headlines flooded the internet. Shaq stands up for little boy in toy store incident, buys every toy. NBA legend turns a child's tears into a moment of justice. Toy store manager fired after discrimination, caught on camera. The video of Shaq crouching down to comfort Lucas racked up millions of views overnight. People flooded the comments. "This is why we love Shaq. He didn't just buy toys, he bought justice. That manager got exactly what he deserved. I swear I'm not crying." "Okay, I'm crying." Then Ms. Carter, the store owner, posted something that sent the internet into a frenzy. "We fired the manager. Our store is open to everyone." The post blew up immediately, with thousands of likes, shares, and comments applauding her decision. Meanwhile, at Shaq's house, his phone buzzed nonstop. But one call stood out. Lucas's mother. Shaq answered, his deep voice calm. "Hello." A choked sob came through the line. "Mr. O'Neill," she sniffled, struggling to hold back tears. I don't know how to thank you." Shaq's expression softened. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "You don't have to," he said simply. "I just wanted to make things right." And that was enough. But Shaq doesn't need thanks. He just wanted to make things right. The past 24 hours had felt like a dream for Lucas. From being kicked out of a store in tears to standing beside Shaquille O'Neal while an entire crowd cheered for him, it didn't feel real. But now things had finally settled. He was back home, sitting on his front porch, his new basketball resting on his lap. His fingers traced the grooves of the ball absent-mindedly. He still couldn't believe it was his. His. No more standing outside store windows, just wishing. No more. "You can't afford that." No more feeling invisible. His mom stepped out, smiling softly as she watched him. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" Lucas nodded, gripping the ball tighter. "Yeah, I just keep thinking, what if Shaq never showed up?" His mother swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "But he did, baby. He did." And just as she said those words, a loud honk came from the street. Lucas's head snapped up. His mom turned, frowning as she wiped her hands on her apron. A massive white delivery truck rolled to a stop in front of their house. Lucas shot to his feet. "What's that?" The driver hopped out, clipboard in hand. "Delivery for Lucas Miller." Lucas's eyes went huge. His mom rushed forward. "There must be a mistake." The driver grinned. "No mistake, ma'am. This is from Shaquille O'Neal." Lucas froze. Then the truck doors swung open. Inside, box after box after box, filled with brand new toys. Lucas's jaw dropped. His mom gasped, covering her mouth. But then, something else caught Lucas's eye. At the very front of the truck, sitting atop all the boxes, was a basketball. Not just any basketball, a signed basketball. Lucas stared, his breath hitching. The delivery guy handed it to him gently, along with a folded note. Lucas's hands shook as he opened it. "Keep practicing. See you in the NBA someday. Shaq." His vision blurred. His mom, full-on sobbing. Lucas screamed with excitement. clutching the ball to his chest. Then, without thinking, he ran outside, dribbling it down the street, grinning ear to ear. Lucas runs outside, dribbling his new ball, grinning ear to ear. The video of Shaq and Lucas had already taken the internet by storm, but it wasn't over yet. News channels, sports networks, and social media platforms couldn't stop talking about it. Footage of Shaq standing up for Lucas, buying out the store, and donating all the toys had been shared millions of times. But one moment stood out the most: an exclusive sit-down interview with Shaq. The clip opened with a close-up shot of Shaq, seated in a studio, relaxed but powerful. His massive frame barely fit in the chair, but his expression? Calm, confident, certain. The reporter, a well-dressed woman with a poised demeanor, smiled as she faced him. "Shaq, the whole world has seen what you did for that little boy. Why step in?" Shaq tilted his head slightly, thinking for a second. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I wasn't gonna let a kid get treated like that," he said, his voice steady but firm. The reporter nodded, flipping through her notes. "Most people would have walked away, maybe posted about it online. But you bought the entire store. You donated everything. Why go so far?" Shaq didn't hesitate. "Because I can," he said simply. Then with a small shrug, he added, "And if you can, you should." The reporter's face softened. The studio fell silent for a moment. That was it. No elaborate explanation, no long speech, just a simple truth. And that truth hit home for millions. The clip was shared across every platform, racking up millions of likes, retweets, and comments. Shaq is built different. If you ever wonder what real power looks like, it's this. Not all heroes wear capes. Some just buy entire stores. Legend, that's it. That's the post. Sports analysts praised him. Celebrities reposted it. Even athletes from other leagues chimed in, calling it one of the most wholesome moments of the year. But Shaq, he didn't care about the headlines. He wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't doing it for likes, shares, or comments. He just saw a kid who needed someone. And so, as the interview wrapped up, the reporter leaned in with one final question. "Shaq, after everything that happened, how does it feel to know you've changed this little boy's life forever?" Shaq's lips curled into a smirk. He let out a low chuckle. Then, leaning back in his chair, he simply said, "Just another normal day.